There are two classes of sexual disorders in men, the venereal diseases or infections on the one hand, and the various sexual weaknesses and disturbances of function on the other. Through proper instruction and right living, both, however, may be avoided. In this and the chapters immediately following, we will consider the various special weaknesses of men and the disorders associated with them, after which we will take up the infectious complaints referred to. The prevalence of sexual weaknesses is one of the most amazing conditions with which our civilization is threatened. Everywhere, one finds great numbers of men lacking in the first essential of manhood, virility. To just what extent weaknesses of this kind prevail, it is impossible to say, because owing to their private nature, there is great difficulty in obtaining information upon which to base an estimate. Some investigators, however, after many years of study, have come to the conclusion that at least half of the people in this country are suffering from some degree of sexual weakness or disorder, either mild or severe. Naturally, I cannot venture an opinion as to whether or not such an estimate is correct, but it is probable that it is near the truth and is rather an understatement than an exaggeration. The medical quacks find here a profitable field in which to enrich themselves. In considering this lack or lessening of virility, often called lost manhood, the first need is to understand its causes. If the cause or causes can be discovered in each individual case, it simplifies the problem of finding the correct remedial treatment, which of course must include the removal of these causes. Virility, like health, is natural, and a natural life invariably means virility and all the superb mental and physical qualities associated therewith. Impairment or loss of virility is, in every instance, the result of an unnatural life involving abuses or excesses of various kinds. The influences tending to destroy virility may be of two kinds, those which directly affect the generative system and those which indirectly affect it through lowering the tone of the entire bodily organism. In other words, virility is affected on the one hand by abuses of the generative system itself, and on the other hand by abuses of the body as a whole, as for instance through the use of alcohol or tobacco. A point which cannot be emphasized too strongly is that loss of virility is not a condition which concerns merely the sexual organs, but one that means also a loss of energy and impairment of function throughout the whole body, involving in most instances a failing of mental faculties. Nothing indicates this more clearly than the difficulty of mental concentration in hard, sustained work that is experienced by those suffering in a marked degree from weaknesses of this type. The loss of memory that follows too frequent seminal drains shows very plainly the relation of virility and healthy sexuality to mental vigor. Accordingly, those afflicted with such weaknesses should make every effort to overcome them, not merely for the sake of an improved sexual condition, but for the sake of their general health, physical and mental as well, and in order that they may attain the very greatest success in life. Remember that the generative system is not an isolated organism, something apart from the rest of the body, but is closely related to every other part of it, its connection with the nervous system being especially intimate. I emphasize this point because so many are inclined to take a narrow view of the subject, not recognizing this relationship. And just as influences which lower the vitality of the body as a whole tend to destroy one's sexual power, so the special abuses of the sexual system weaken the entire system. Masturbation is undoubtedly the first and most important of all the causes of sexual weakness. Not only is it the active cause of trouble in by far the greater number of cases, but it is especially serious because it commonly begins earlier in life than other abuses. Owing to the importance of this particular practice in causing both sexual and general debility, I shall devote a special chapter to it. If this one evil could be eliminated, it would save literally millions of men from sexual weakness and the generally lowered vitality that accompanies it. Sexual excesses of any kind, whether within or without the sphere of marriage, tend to weaken and destroy virility. There is an old-fashioned idea that inasmuch as the marriage ceremony sanctions the sexual relation, free indulgence therein between persons who have been united by that ceremony is perfectly proper. but excess is no less a crime against nature because legalized by the marriage certificate. Whether within or without the marriage bond, it is immoral and destructive of sexual perfection. Unfortunately, as I have pointed out in some of the preceding chapters, sexual excesses in marriage appear to be the rule rather than the exception, with the result that there are many unhappy marriages and many debilitated men and women. However, I have already covered most of the practical aspects of this side of the question. The effect of venereal disease in causing a permanent weakening of the sexual function deserves special attention for the reason that such results are overlooked in most cases. Gonorrhea is especially destructive, yet most people are accustomed to think of it simply as a local and temporary disorder which can be easily cured, leaving one's condition just as good as it was before. Even when the effects of gonorrhea in causing sterility, unsexing operations upon women, and blindness in babies are known, it is still supposed by the ordinary man that after the disease has been cured in his own case, he will be through with its effects and as good a man as ever. It is for this reason that I would emphasize the fact that if the disease has once become deep-seated, a man will probably never be quite the same after an attack of gonorrhea. A mild attack, which is confined to the anterior urethra, usually works no permanent injury, but where the infection has penetrated to the deeper structures, the effects may remain even after the actual disease has been overcome. When the testicles or their adjacent parts have been invaded, the inflammation, epididymitis or orchitis, commonly results in sterility, as is well known, but this impaired condition of these essential glands is likely also to affect one's sexual power in every respect. Also, by causing inflammation of the prostate gland or congestion of the posterior urethra, this infection may cause varying degrees of weakness, such as that known as prematurity or even impotence. There are some men who are uninfluenced by moral considerations of any kind and who will not be frightened into good behavior by the prospect of an infection which they believe will cause temporary inconvenience only, but who would be keenly alive to any danger which seemed to threaten them with impotence or any weakness tending in that direction. To such as these, this question of the relation of venereal disease to lessened or lost virility is recommended for special consideration. There are various abnormal and unnatural practices which are just as harmful as masturbation, in some instances even more so, and which may even be classed with masturbation. Among these are unnatural methods of intercourse which, if long continued, tend to bring on either impotence or other serious weaknesses associated with congestion of the prostate gland and other parts of the generative system. The most widespread of these practices is coitus interruptus, often spoken of as withdrawal. This consists in terminating the sexual relation just previous to the climax or moment of highest intensity. This naturally involves a severe shock to the nerve centers concerned and cannot fail to be injurious both locally and to the general system. It is debilitating to the man, but it is usually an outrage upon the woman. The relation, if entered into at all, should be carried through in an absolutely natural manner, resulting in the orgasm or climax being experienced by both husband and wife. If this does not occur, then it is devitalizing in its effect. Men who practice this method of intercourse for a term of years gradually experience a lessening of power, the ejaculation either being retarded or becoming more and more premature, and also develop a train of symptoms characteristic of nervous disorders as well as digestive and other functional disturbances. Another injurious practice is the attempt to prolong the marital act beyond natural limits. The direct effect of this is to bring about a serious congestion of all the parts concerned, though it is probably most exhausting to the nerve centers involved. Of course, the sexual act can only be prolonged by stopping it from time to time. Even then, if it is finally terminated in a natural manner, the result is not so bad as when the attempt is made to avoid the orgasm entirely. This is thoroughly unnatural and invariably harmful in the long run. Yet not only has this method been practiced by the members of the Oneida community and by many others, but there are still some writers who advocate it, on the theory that by conserving vital energy through the retention of the spermatic fluid, it prolongs life. There has been so much trash and nonsense written and thought about sexual matters that it is a safe plan for the average reader to beware of any unscientific teachings on the subject. If one wishes to conserve vital energy by avoiding the waste of the spermatic fluid, then the way to do it is to live a continent life free from sexual excitement of any kind. Or, if not a completely celibate life, one in which temperance in the marital relation results naturally from obedience to a wife's normal instincts, as suggested in previous chapters. To avoid waste of this fluid, it is not necessary to practice absolute continence, and certainly there can be no advantage in achieving such an end by the sexually exciting yet unnatural practice of engaging in sexual relationships in which the orgasm is suppressed. The harm done to the nerve centers under such conditions and the congestion of the parts will more than offset the fancied advantage of retaining the spermatic fluid. If the passions have been aroused to the extent of demanding the sexual act, and if it has been entered into, then it should be concluded naturally. Ungratified passion undoubtedly has a weakening effect in the course of time, and for this reason it is the height of folly, when it is impossible to gratify naturally the passions likely to be aroused, to persist in close personal intimacy with one of the opposite sex, with much fondling and caressing. I have referred to this in the chapter on love-making and its dangers, and it applies particularly to prolonged engagements in which the parties concerned take many personal liberties with each other in the way of ardent kissing and spooning. An occasional experience of this kind would have comparatively little effect upon a healthy organism, but when it is repeated day after day for an extended period of time, it is weakening and destructive in the extreme. If the man finally marries, he will likely to find himself suffering from prematurity or even more serious weakness. If passion cannot be gratified, it should not be aroused. Whether continence is harmful or not, a question which has been very widely discussed with much difference of opinion, depends almost entirely upon whether or not one can live a life comparatively free from sexual excitement. If one can avoid sexual stimulation, it is both easy and beneficial to live a completely continent life. But if one has very strong sexual instincts and one's passions are frequently aroused, then continuous abstinence would not only be difficult but unsatisfactory in its influence on the general health. To avoid sexual excitement, it is not alone necessary to avoid the physical intimacies above mentioned. Erotic thoughts will do just as much harm, and after the habit of stimulating the sexual centers mentally has once been formed, it is likely to be very persistent and insidious in its influence. This sensual state of mind keeps the sex centers in a state of constant excitement and the organs concerned in a state of congestion. It leads to prostate trouble, urethral congestion and irritability, varicocele, and a general weakening of the entire function. This habit can best be described by the term mental masturbation, and the fact is that after a time, as a result of its weakening effect, it becomes possible for the victim to induce an emission merely through his thoughts. Of course, this indicates that he has reached a serious weakness. The general bodily influences which tend to destroy virility may be said to include almost anything that lowers vitality and weakens the body as a whole, and particularly anything that acts as a poison to the system. Alcohol is regarded by many men in the medical profession as a sexual stimulant, but there is nothing more destructive of reproductive integrity in the long run. Without doubt, its stimulating quality is only apparent, the result of a lessening of the moral sense or the natural restraint which would be exercised in a normal and sober condition. Any sense of delicacy in behavior which one may possess is blunted through the influence of alcohol, and without doubt its reputation as a sexual stimulant is due largely to this fact. Not only are the children of alcoholic fathers constitutionally weak or prone to nervous and mental deficiencies, epilepsy and lunacy, but the direct result upon the drinker himself is a tendency toward impotence, greater or less according to the extent of his indulgence in intoxicants. It is true that some constitutions can stand a great deal more abuse than others, and in some cases one may imagine that the use of alcohol or tobacco is doing no harm. But if so, it is only because their evil effects are not at first so pronounced as to be apparent, or because one's perceptions are blunted. Sooner or later, their harmfulness will be manifested unmistakably. The fact is that in a great many cases of chronic alcoholism, the victims are absolutely and permanently impotent. It is obvious that if the extended use of this poison will bring about this result, even a moderate or small indulgence must have a weakening effect upon the reproductive system. There is a widespread notion that the so-called lighter alcoholic beverages such as beer and wine are comparatively harmless. There are some writers who even advocate a freer use of these as a means of doing away with the use of spirits. The prohibition movement in France is directed only against the sale of spirituous liquors, there being no hope of curtailing the sale or use of wines and beers, and perhaps no desire to do so. The truth is that the lighter alcoholic beverages are likely to do just as much harm as the heavier beverages because of the greater quantity consumed. One is likely to secure just as much alcohol in a large glass of beer with its 4.5% of the poison as in a very small portion of some spirit with its 40 or 50% of alcohol. It all depends on the size of the portion. One great disadvantage of beer and wine is the tendency to use them regularly. It is known to life insurance actuaries and other students of the subject that the moderate indulgence, which so many persons think harmless, is the very worst form of alcoholism because it is so often regular. The continuous daily use of alcohol, however moderate, undermines the system and does most harm. Occasional actual drunkenness with or more or less extended intervals of complete sobriety will do less harm to the liver, kidneys, heart, and arteries than regular, moderate indulgence. And the same rule would doubtless apply to the reproductive system. Some authorities declare that beer is the most injurious of all intoxicants so far as the sexual function is concerned.